I'm so honored and grateful to get to be here to pick your brain about it. So to start off, I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how this project found you, or how you found this project.
Yes, thank you, Tess, and thank you all for coming. And no, thank you for making this work. This is like a big job. I can talk really loud, as most people in here know. So I think the project, the kind of intellectual roots of the project come out of my experience being a freshman girl my first week of school when 9/11 happened, and being a kind of budding feminist, and then seeing in the aftermath of the attack and the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, people like Laura Bush using this rhetoric of we need to protect women in Afghanistan, and now that we've invaded, women are free, the whole civilized world agrees that we need to protect these women. And I thought, we're protecting women by bombing their country, and I knew there was a long-standing movement for women's rights. So I was interested in the ways, and people got on board, feminists got on board with this. This was fairly popular rhetoric and sort of rationale for what the US military was doing. And I was really interested in how this kind of rhetoric, this language about protecting women from violence and from sexual violence, there were definitely kind of sexual undertones, was used in these really powerful ways as a kind of smokescreen for American military, political, and economic interests. And so how sexuality, women, gender issues weren't just kind of issues of women or family or the home, but actually were the stuff of international politics. And so those kind of questions were percolating for me when I went to grad school and sort of shape why I decided to write this book and why I was interested in finding out about how Americans shaped international anti-prostitution and anti-trafficking efforts, because I saw a lot of these parallels between the idea of, well, of course you arrest women, you close down borders as a way of protecting women. I saw the kind of parallels in that rhetoric.
I love that your lived experience is sort of what brought you to this. And I think you see that in the book too, because you write the book through stories of individuals and their experiences, which I absolutely love. I'm wondering if you can tell us how you chose to write the book that way, or why you chose to write that book the way, and if you have a favorite story that you'd be willing to share with us.
I came to the book that way because that's what brought me to history. I'm like a nosy person who loves other people's stories. So that was what I was drawn to. And in documents like these sort of records of all these investigations, even police reports, you find people's stories. So I was really drawn to them. And I think the story I want to share is the one that starts the book off. So it's this story of two people who end up making these trips to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, but the way they get there and what it means is really different. So first we have Marie, who's a French woman. She's living in Nice, she's a ballet dancer, and she's sometimes selling sex to supplement her income. She has a mother, she has 4 sisters, and she has a daughter, a 2-year-old, who she calls her adopted daughter, but is likely her biological daughter, who she doesn't want to sort of admit that she had a child out of wedlock. And so, but she's really having trouble making ends meet, as are millions of people in Europe in the 1920s. And she has a boyfriend who becomes violent, and so she decides she's gonna try her luck and go to the Americas. So she gets on a ship. She's sailing for South America. She thinks she's gonna go to Buenos Aires, Argentina first, but discovers that the border control people won't let in women who have ever sold sex before or who seem sort of sexually suspicious, right? A woman traveling on her own. So another woman on the ship says, go to Rio de Janeiro. There's great places to work there. And so she finds herself in a place recommended by this woman on the ship. And she starts to make a lot of money. She's a white, this is at the time in the 1920s, where white French women have this kind of erotic cachet. And so she's making a lot of money, and she's sort of avoiding a lot of the police harassment that Eastern European Jewish women, migrants are facing, that women of African descent are facing who are selling sex. And she is having regular dates with high-up officials in the government. And she's making so much money that she opens a savings account. And she sort of hatches this plan that she's going to save up a bunch of money and then send over for her sisters to come over to Rio. They're going to open a brothel together where they can keep all of their earnings. And they're going to then save up again and then go back to France wealthy and able to just take care of their families and live their lives. And so we have Marie. And then we have Paul. So into this brothel in 1924 appears this man named Paul Kinsey. And Paul is there to investigate the traffic in women in this huge international investigation. And he comes to the brothel, and what he sees are a bunch of white French women in Brazil. So he decides that they must be, this is evidence of trafficking. And then he finds out that Marie not only came to the US, or came to Brazil from France, but that she wants to send for her sisters. So not only is she a trafficking victim, but she's also a trafficker. So we have two really different versions of this trip to Rio. And my book shows how Paul's wins out, right? Paul's version is that this is a crime, and the solutions are criminalizing commercial sex and controlling borders. And that becomes the policy vision that really guides international policy kind of to this day. But Marie's vision, I think, actually shows us kind of more what's really happening, right? That she's an economic migrant, that she doesn't have a problem of sex, she has a labor problem, an economic problem. And she is much more like the millions of migrants coming to the Americas from Europe than she is different from them just because she sells sex.
Going off of the labor, prostitution has been referred to as the oldest profession. And so I wonder if you can give a brief history in the United States of what prostitution looked like prior to the social purity movement.
Yeah, so in the 18th, 19th century, right, it's called oldest profession for a reason, right? People have exchanged sex for money, goods, protection, forever. Historians never say forever, but pretty much forever. But what that means has been really different according to time and place. And so in the US, in the 18th, 19th century US, prostitution was really thought of as a problem of kind of public order. And so there were laws against things like common night walking and anything that was sort of disruptive to public order, public morals. And then from time to time, when there would be a kind of swell of religious revivalism, there would be crackdowns and raids on known brothels or known districts where women were streetwalkers. But then that would sort of go away and it would be part of the urban fabric again. Where we see that start to change is in the middle of the 19th century, where Americans start to say, hey, there's this way that they're dealing with prostitution in Europe, and maybe we should do it too. And so what's happening in Europe, and really France is the place where this gets developed, is that countries and local governments are regulating prostitution as an issue of public health and disease control rather than one of public order. And so what they're doing is creating a system of kind of licensing and inspection where a woman gets registered as a prostitute, sometimes because she signs up, sometimes because an official decides she looks like one. And then she submits to regular medical examinations, and if she's found to carry a sexually transmitted infection, she is incarcerated in a hospital for mandatory treatment, and then she's released. And she usually pays some sort of fines and fees to keep this system going. And so this is sort of seen as the height of this new scientific kind of method of prostitution control. And so in the 1850s, Americans get interested in experimenting with it. And that's really the kind of prehistory to my book. So my book starts with what's called the social purity movement. There are all these kind of ridiculous phrases in my book that sound normal to me, like social purity, who wouldn't say that? But that sound weird to, I don't know, everyday people on the street. So that's when the social purity movement starts, is into these debates about what do we do? Do we regulate it as a matter of public health? Do we sort of treat it as this issue of public order that we kind of sweep under the rug from time to time but sort of let be? Or is there another way forward?
I guess I want to skip forward into some of my questions because you're talking about something that I was completely unaware of until reading your book, and that is the American plan. There are a few things, or there's so much about the history of treatment of women that just makes me rage. And so if you all need fuel for a fire, please, I want Eva to tell you about the American plan. Will you tell us about the American plan?
Happily. So the American Plan is the name given to the U.S.'s World War I kind of anti-prostitution and venereal disease control platform. And it's called the American Plan specifically to set it apart from what any other military is doing, right? These kind of European methods of regulation. So the American Plan has 3 parts. It has the kind of suppression of prostitution, the legal prohibition of prostitution and arrest of women, the providing what's called prophylaxis, but really is sort of treatment after exposure to soldiers who admit to visiting a prostitute. There's a kind of very unpleasant whole system of injections and creams and things with mercury and arsenic compounds that are supposedly prevent disease. They don't really work. And then the third part is healthy recreation. So this is where we see the kind of like popularization of like basketball and boxing and as sort of all American sports. So there's a big push to get men to, again, get out their energy in healthy ways so they won't visit prostitutes or what's unspoken, have sex with each other. That fear is always there. And so this comes about because these reformers really take over the military in this World War I moment as a way to kind of push through this policy. So when this policy is implemented in the U.S. right in 1917, it very quickly leads to these mass arrests of women. So on the U.S. mainland, federal numbers suggest that something like 30,000 women were arrested and incarcerated immediately after the war. But scholars think the numbers are often even up to like 60,000 because a lot of women were held in local jails, so weren't part of those numbers. And this becomes even more striking, these numbers, when you compare them to the number of people arrested for pro-German sentiments, so people who were actually considered potential traitors. There were 6,000 of those arrested. So the idea is that any sort of suspicious woman who might be a prostitute, who might give a soldier disease, could be arrested, and that was way more dangerous. These women were way more dangerous than a potential traitor. So the American Plan on the mainland, and there's some pushback against it. There's a small group of women who try and fight it and really kind of fail. In general, in the US, suffragists, many feminists get on board and say, yeah, this is what we have to do for the war effort. This is the right thing to do. Now, when this plan travels with the bodies of soldiers, U.S. soldiers, as they go to other countries, it becomes even more violent. And we really see this in the Caribbean, U.S. colonies in the Caribbean during the war. So even though on the mainland there's this whole there's been this anti-prostitution crusade, and there are really no remaining red light districts at this point, the U.S. military in colonies like Puerto Rico, in the Dominican Republic, which the U.S. is occupying at this point, in the Philippines, is overseeing brothels, right? Is instituting these systems of regulated prostitution. But then they decide pretty much overnight to implement the American Plan in these spaces, and so what has been a kind of accepted form, even considered necessary form of labor, immediately becomes a crime, which allows for these mass arrests of women, and really mass arrests of women in comparison to the number of U.S. troops present. And because these are women living in as colonial subjects, they don't have the same rights that even don't really protect the U.S. mainland American women. And so we see things like in Puerto Rico, we see incarcerated women being used for medical testing. So they try to, they see what happens when they give them really, really intense versions of accepted treatments, because as they say, they can't protest, they can't leave, right? The problem with giving really intense treatments to a regular person on the street is they can just be like, this hurts too much, my teeth are all falling out, and I feel like I'm dying, please don't inject me with mercury. But incarcerated women can't do that. So they use them as test subjects. And then in the Panama Canal Zone, I found evidence of US officials sterilizing women. And they do this, they say, as a form of kind of moral uplift. So they say when they remove women's diseased organs, and when they do hysterectomies whenever it's practicable, right, whenever it's easy for them, that actually women show mental improvement. Their morals improve, and they want to do honest work. So it's kind of a labor policy for them as well. And the legacies of the American plan still exist. So in the Caribbean, these kind of legacies of criminalizing prostitution absolutely influence how the Trujillo in the Dominican Republic moves forward with criminalizing prostitution as a way of cracking down on kind of organized labor and working class people. And we see in the US, these laws are on the books. These laws criminalizing prostitution are still on the books, right? Prostitution is still illegal in every state except for 10 counties in Nevada. And we also see it, some of the laws, they stopped getting enforced in the 70s as strongly, but we still see their legacies in laws against, for example, aggravated prostitution. So aggravated prostitution laws deem it a felony if you commit prostitution or attempt to commit prostitution if you knowingly have HIV or AIDS. And so it criminalizes disease status, and that it's a felony. And so some states, actually Tennessee, just rolled back their aggravated prostitution statute, which is really surprising, but they're on the books in many places, and this is a direct legacy of the American plan.
Wow. While I was reading your work, I was struck by the shared ideological foundations of Horatio Storer's campaign against abortion, along with Anthony Comstock's censorship laws, with the anti-prostitution and anti-trafficking frameworks of that era. And I'm wondering, how did the shared ideological foundations of these campaigns influence broader societal attitudes towards women's autonomy and the policing of sexuality, and how do they continue to influence modern frameworks around issues like reproductive rights?
So it's really interesting. In this early, 1870s, 1880s milieu, where we see someone like Comstock, right, it is this moment where everyone's talking about sex is a big deal, and everyone's trying to figure out what to do about it. And so you have people like Comstock who are like, suppress it, ban it, shove it back into a little box, let's not talk about it, except to do that we still have to talk about it a lot, but not in public. We get kind of free love movements that are like, keep the state out of it, let's all, follow our own spiritual paths. And then we get people like social purity reformers, and in some ways they have a similarity to Comstock. They are advocating for a very conservative vision of sexual morality that keeps sex in the kind of conjugal, reproductive household, heterosexual, monogamous household. And yet, right, Comstock hates women. He's a profound misogynist. I think scholars generally accept that. And so part of why he is doing this really is to punish women who are seeking information about birth control, who are seeking, any information really about reproduction or being able to control their own health and bodies. Social purity reformers, right, these early reformers in the 1870s and 80s, their platform is different. They want to bring conversations about sex and prostitution into the open to dismantle the double standard. They're very angry and that's why they're against ideas about regulated prostitution, because they make laws that affect the woman person in the sexual relationship, but just let the man do whatever he wants. So a woman gets, has to be held in a prison hospital and treated for disease, or a man can do anything he wants. So they are not laws that are okay in a democracy. And so they come to this movement from a place of wanting to improve women's rights, right? They think if they can dismantle the double standard, they actually can increase women's political, economic participation. Now, the people that who have the most in common, I think, with Comstock and Storer are the social hygiene reformers. So this new movement that emerges from the social purity reform movement at the turn of the century. And this is when the movement professionalizes. So women are pushed out and professional men take their places, much like the kind of abortion narrative where we're taking reproductive control out of the hands of midwives of women and trying to kind of put it in the hands of doctors with credentials. And like Comstock, these are the architects of the American plan. Like Comstock, I think they really, part of what they are trying to do is, right, in the 19-teens, at this moment where women are advocating for suffrage and advocating for a larger role in society, and certainly doing that in World War I, they want to keep them in their place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going along that line too, the ideology of American exceptionalism is at the forefront of your work, and which is deeply intertwined with eugenics, racism, and anxieties around immigration. And so I was wondering if you could connect the dots for us using white slavery through the Page Act and then the subsequent Mann Act that you discussed.
So my book, there's a period where I look at the kind of transformation of the white slavery narrative. So the white slavery narrative is this idea that swarthy foreign men or African American men are selling kind of innocent, native-born white women from the countryside into sexual slavery, into brothels of the cities. And basically every country has some version of this story. But in the US, very early on, it gets tied up with immigration. And so, and I also want to point out that, right, even the idea of white slavery in the US context has this really particular valence. So it both sort of makes this claim that white women in prostitution is even more unthinkable and way more horrible than anything that happened to black women in chattel slavery, and kind of erases the sexual violence of chattel slavery, but also claims the kind of moral authority of that anti-slavery abolitionists and says, like, this is the next great crusade. So it's doing, like, a lot of work. So that's sort of one part of the narrative, right? Rescuing innocent white girls, native-born girls. But the other side of the white slavery narrative we see with things like the Page Act. So the Page Act is the first federal immigration act in 1975. Before that, immigration was handled by states. And it does three things. It says keep out Chinese contract laborers, prostitutes, and criminals. And so from the very start, federal immigration law is about racial exclusion and about kind of deciding who is sexually fit for citizenship and who is not. And immigration laws elaborate on this, again, as a way of keeping out the bad women. And so by 1910, you see an immigration act that's called the White Slavery Act that allows for the deportation of any immigrant woman who sells sex at any time after her arrival in the U.S. So she could be in the U.S. for 20 years, and as long as she hasn't become a citizen, she's deportable. And that same year, you see the 1910 Mann Act, which is an act that sort of is supposed to deal with the other side of the white slavery narrative, the let's protect our innocent girls side of the white slavery narrative. So it says, it makes it a crime to transport any woman or girl across state lines for a range of sexual things and any other immoral purpose, very big. And then it does so with or without her consent. So it makes consent kind of immaterial, it makes it legally impossible. And so with these two acts in 1910, again, you get this, I think the kind of paradoxical nature of the white slavery narrative, right? It can be used to protect, innocent native-born girls, and it can be used to exclude bad foreign women, again, as a form of protecting them and protecting the United States, right? That means that these laws are all about discretion. So they can be used by people with power to target who they want to target and leave the other people. And the Mann Act, a great example of this is the black boxer Jack Johnson, right? He is prosecuted under the Mann Act for taking his white wife across state lines. And it's actually, she is a former sex worker, but because this white slavery narrative sort of rescues from her that and makes her this ideal victim. And this, right, so it's used not out of any concern about women's well-being, but as a means of targeting black men who step out of line.
Yeah. So your book concludes bringing us to the present day. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more on why there was a focus on human trafficking and sex work that returned in the 1990s and 2000. And you touched on it a little bit in your intro, but how 9/11 played a part in that as well.
Yeah, so part of what's interesting to me about this moment, that I see these really interesting parallels with this post-World War I moment, is it's another moment in the United States where kind of sexual issues come to the fore, and the US also is in this interesting position of global political power. So in the 1980s and 90s, with the kind of rise of the religious right, we do see a growing interest in, again, sort of sexual issues and sex trafficking as one of them. And then it really takes off in the Bush presidency. And then with this 9/11 moment, this is a moment where the US becomes a hyperpower, right? Becomes really more powerful than it kind of ever has been. And the Bush administration absolutely uses this as a moment to enforce and export American-style kind of carceral prohibitionist anti-trafficking policy around the world. One example of this is that the Bush administration passes, it's a bipartisan bill, it's still in effect, that ties funding for trafficking, for HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, ties it to a kind of anti-prostitution pledge. So NGOs or other governments that want to take money for any of those things have to explicitly not accept that sex work is work and have to have an anti-prostitution stance. And so some governments have turned down large amounts of funding for HIV/AIDS work. In Brazil, one official said that we can't take this money because our programs partner with sex workers. How are we supposed to say we're against the very people we're working with? And there's a lot of research that suggests those kinds of partnerships, right, between the people who are most effective and the government is actually the most effective way to improve people's lives and curb the spread of disease. And it's very similar to the kind of anti-abortion pledge too, right, which ties funding to having an anti-abortion status. So again, it's this moment of using this heightened US power to take what are kind of particularly carceral American laws about sex and export them abroad.
Okay, this is perhaps the question I'm most excited to hear your response to, and probably also the most loaded one. So, are you ready? So, as you know, sex work remains illegal in most of the U.S., except for a few regulated areas in Nevada. Debates persist about the merits of legalization, decriminalization, continued criminalization, or the Nordic model, which criminalizes buyers, not sellers. Given the historical insights in your book, do you have a stance on the best path forward? And how would you explain your reasoning to the diverse stakeholders involved, including sex workers themselves, public health professionals, law enforcement, advocacy groups, religious institutions, policymakers, and academics?
I have the solution to everything. No, right, this is a really complex question, but I do really think that looking at the history provides some helpful ways forward. So, in terms of what we have now, criminalization, I think we have a lot of evidence that it doesn't work, that it leads to putting very vulnerable people in jail, and then it leads to broad surveillance that entraps more people in the criminal legal system. For example, trans women are often arrested just for being on the street because police assume they are sex workers. So I think we have a sense that criminalization, right, in the past, it led to a lot of women being in jail. In the present, it leads to women being in jail, and to me, that's not a form of help. The Nordic model is interesting, right? The Nordic model, again, criminalizes the sex purchaser. To me, the Nordic model kind of frames the problem incorrectly. So the Nordic model is also sometimes called the end-demand model because it frames sex work as the commercial sex industry is this sort of easy market equation, and if you just take out the demand, right, the kind of sexually deviant male, then everything will go away. But we know, we have lots of evidence that that's not what leads to the commercial sex industry in a lot of ways, right? That for people who sell sex, there are a lot of complicated push and pull factors that push and pull them into the industry. And a huge one is economic, their own economic status. And we know, I have evidence of this from the 1870s all the way to the 1930s, and other scholars have evidence of this going far back, that people, particularly vulnerable people without a lot of other opportunities, can make far more money in less time selling sex than they can doing almost anything else. And that really holds true today when sociologists who work on sex work produce studies. What people often say is that it's a kind of gig, right? It allows you to work on your own schedule. It allows you fast money, right? If you have a bill that needs to get paid, it's all well and good to work a job that gives you a paycheck every 2 weeks, but that's not going to help you right now. And so sex work provides a kind of economic lifeline for a lot of really vulnerable people. End demand doesn't address that. In fact, it just kind of brings the police back into it and further stigmatizes sex work. Legalization is interesting because on the surface you'd think, like, great, legalization, but actually a lot of sex workers' rights advocates and activists don't want that, precisely because it can often look a lot like regulation looked in the 1870s, right, where there's kinds of licensing, inspections, mandatory examinations, and all of this is carried out by some kind of police. And the people I look at in my archives, and a lot of sex workers today, repeatedly talk about police harassment and assault, right? That is a huge part of the violence they face in their lives. And so inviting people who are, of course not always, but often treating them disrespectfully at the best and really violently at the worst, doesn't make any sense to them. Even though, right, of course there are benefits of having kind of government regulation of workplaces, but I think for most sex workers today, or the activists I'm familiar with, the world as it is today, right, if we're taking a kind of harm reduction model, that makes their lives worse. So I think where I land as a historian and a person, feminist, is on decriminalization, because I think it reduces the harm as best we possibly can. And I also really think in the past, right, as in today, listening to sex worker activists, I think have often a good sense of their vulnerabilities, the sort of structural factors they're facing, is really important. And so with decriminalization, I think we can see, in the past, it allows people to continue to make income. It's of course not a perfect solution, but it prevents a lot of the violence and the getting tied up with the criminal justice system that people who sell sex often say makes their lives much harder than the act selling sex itself, right? It's the lack of health care, it's the hunger, it's the lack of affordable housing. Like, those are the problems. It's the police violence and violence at the hands of clients.
And the link to sex trafficking.
And the link to sex trafficking. Ooh. So, right, in a lot of policy, UN policy is sort of changing this and acknowledging that there can be consensual commercial sex, migratory consensual commercial sex. But I still think, especially in the US, criminalizing sex work leads to many very vulnerable women who are trafficked getting deported. So the US has a program to give victims of severe trafficking, sex trafficking is considered a primary one of those forms, a visa to allow them to stay in the US. The US has never given out the maximum number, so they can give out 5,000 a year. That has never happened. And in the first Trump administration, the number really tanked with a kind of growth of hardline immigration policy, and people are really concerned about that today. So I think even then, I think we have evidence that criminalizing consensual commercial sex does not protect people from sex trafficking, and in fact makes it harder to identify and help people who are victims because of the likelihood that they will be treated as criminals.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this work, and I'm wondering, what is your next project?
I've got a few things. One, I think the one I'm pretty excited about is a history of infectious disease contact tracing, which kind of comes about, again, from my lived experience, right? When I'm looking at all these records in the 19-teens, 1920s, and I'm like, why is there all this sort of surveillance? Why are they tracking people with disease? Like I see proto-contact tracing. I see the U.S. military like making people fill out these forms, soldiers fill out these forms that say like, name the woman who gave you the disease, and we're gonna go track her and give her a pelvic examination, right? Which I think is really bad. And yet, during COVID, I was like, we gotta contact trace, like we gotta figure this out. And I was like, oh, yeah, we do need public health infrastructure. But the problem is in the US, the history of public health infrastructure, it's been tied to policing. But what does it look like when it's not tied to policing? And there are these great examples from the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 80s of communities figuring out ways of understanding how disease is moving in a population as an act of community care, not an act of policing. So to me, it's these kind of interesting ethical issues, but these interesting historical issues. And there are also a lot of fun characters along the way. There's like a woman statistician who runs the World War II contact tracing program, and then is eventually pushed out of the government, possibly for her own sexual orientation, unclear. So there's interesting people along the way too.
Well, thank you so much. So I think questions are open now. Anybody?
Can you talk about the evolution, the term consent, how that emerges in this whole debate, and how it sort of wedges in between criminalization and acceptance, and how it protects those who are minor? I mean, can you talk just quickly about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's very complicated, and it's there from the beginning because, again, these early debates about prostitution that are happening simultaneously with debates about chattel slavery are revolving around like what can you give consent to, what is a contract, you know, again, what can you agree to about selling your body or selling your labor. Now, some of these campaigners actually worked on age of consent campaigns. That was a big part of what they did and kind of one of their most lasting legacies. So in Delaware, the age of consent was 7. And so they saw this campaign that raised the age of consent in some places to 21, right? I mean, again, it's this kind of complicated thing of like, what do we think about that? But to me, where consent becomes sort of important is when the possibility of consent becomes legally foreclosed. So with the Mann Act, and that you could, in fact, be charged with like trafficking yourself, right? So that there's no sense of women's agency, and it also puts the kind of foreclosing consent like that puts the onus. Again, it frames it as like a sort of individual problem of like criminal and victim, and not as a kind of broader structural problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question concerns more like national security, which I think you touched on a little bit, but in your studies, did you come across any reasoning for cracking down on prostitution being due to concerns about those prostitutes either gaining access to state secrets or like localized military information, passing that on to the enemy or hostile state actors, or what do you think about?
No, I didn't see any of that, but I saw repeatedly the kind of language that these women were more dangerous than bullets, right? Because not only would they infect men, American men with diseases, that they would bring back home to their wives, right? But that they would also sort of change their moral habits. Like they wouldn't be American anymore, they'd like be a little bit French, you know? That it would really kind of change their, they could sort of civilizationally like degrade in kind of eugenic terms from sex with sex workers and also kind of like not, you know, non-procreative sex acts. One more? Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I just really would. So you said that you prefer decriminalization, and Nevada has 11 counties that where is legal. What does that look like? Did they have the issues that that you describe in your book, please?
You know, I am definitely not an expert on like contemporary things, and actually, I think there are not active brothels in many of those counties. Like, I think the industry is not. I think there's all kinds of problems with legalization as it works in Nevada, right? And with a huge amount of sex work happening outside of the bounds of these small, legal, refuges. So I think decriminalization is not without its problems. I do think, and I see this in my research too, there is a problem when there's like one little place where things are decriminalized and then it's criminalized all around it. Like you saw that all the time, Americans like flocking to Cuba and behaving like really badly. And in fact, creating huge amounts of problems in Cuba because of kind of crackdown on commercial sex